All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. Okay. Good morning. Good morning. Yeah. Well, thanks for coming. Welcome to Stanford. Really excited to meet everyone here. Welcome to the AI for Health workshop. So it's day 3 of our joint event with Stanford Compute Forum. So my name's James Stowe. I am a professor here at Stanford. And I'm also the faculty director for the Stanford AI for Health program. Right, so the program is basically really a platform for faculties and students at Stanford to collaborate and to share our research with our industry collaborators and partners. Right? And we have been having a lot of really exciting collaborations right, through this platform with insurance companies, pharma companies, right, biotech startups. Right? So it's been really fruitful collaborations. Right. And I want to especially thank Joseph, right, who's our executive director, and he's also going to be around today, and he has all the details of how this program works, how we do these collaborations. Also want to thank Nancy for helping us to put these events together, so thank you very much. So we have an exciting day of sort of research presentations, right? So the idea here is to really have these pretty lively and informal discussions where the faculties and students will share the latest research we're doing, and hopefully that can spark some interesting discussions and potential collaborations with folks here in the audience. Right? So there'll be 3 faculties, so I'll start first, and then we'll have 2 colleagues, so Dan and Serena, who'll share their research, and then we'll also have 4 student speakers who will be sharing some of the really exciting work that they're all doing. Right? And then we'll have lunch after that, right? And with a coffee break in between. So then we can just go ahead and dive in. So a lot of my research recently has been focused around how do we develop these generative AI tools, right, like large language models, multimodal language models, and applying them for a variety of biomedical and healthcare applications. So just to give you a sense of how these tools are already being used, right, so as a professor, I spend a lot of time reading papers and writing papers. Right, and recently we're interested in trying to see, like, okay, so how much of these papers that we're reading, right, people are publishing, have been written by large language models, right? So we actually developed a way to quantify, right, to take basically all the papers people recently put on the archive or published, right, in Nature family journals, and we have an algorithm to actually quantify what fraction of those papers have been substantially written by our large language model. Right? And so that's what we found is shown here in this plot. Right, and this around like November 23 is when ChatGPT is first launched, or 22 is when ChatGPT is launched, right? And you can actually see a pretty rapid increase, whereas currently our estimate is, right, if I look at all the archive papers in computer science, around 17% of those, the most recent archive papers, have been substantially written by a large language model. Right? Just give you a sense that this field is really changing extremely quickly, right? We're also interested in, right, like what fraction of the peer reviews we get on these papers have been written by a large language model, right? And it turns out that you get a lot of signal. Because, for example, if we look at specific words like commendable, it's actually much more likely to be used by a ChatGPT when it's writing a review of a paper than it is to be used by human reviewers, right? And those kind of words all see a really big spike, especially after the release of ChatGPT, right? So that gives us some signal that people are using language models to help them to write reviews. And for reviews, our estimate across the most recent batch of AI conferences, right, where we have the publicly available reviews, is that's really around like about 10 to 16% of a lot of these conference reviews also have been substantially generated by AI. And that number is also going up very quickly, right? So this, I think, gives us a sense of the landscape that these models are becoming extremely influential, right, in scientific research. Right? It's already being used to write papers and to also to generate reviews of these papers, right? And what I want to focus on today is really looking at let's say the healthcare settings, right? So how can we expand and leverage these models to really make an impact across different healthcare problems? And in particular, when we think about medicine and healthcare, it's important to think about the different kinds of stakeholders, right, who are the different potential users of these tools. because they all have very different problems that we want to solve, right? So the three main kinds of stakeholders that we often work with in our research are basically clinicians, patients, and researchers. Right, so each group of people would have very different problems, and we want to develop different types of algorithms to adapt it to these different stakeholders. Right, so for clinicians, one of the big challenges they often face is that they have to aggregate information from all these different sources. Right, like if a patient comes in, right, they have to figure out, the clinician have to figure out, what are the relevant similar patients, how to find relevant information from previous medical records, right, from other resources. And that can be very, takes a lot of time, especially when the clinician have to deal with many hundreds of different patients. Right? So for that, we've been working on building these visual language models, basically as like co-pilots to help physicians, clinicians to aggregate information, to summarize the relevant information. So I'll give you an example how that works. For patients, one of the big challenges they face is that they're just being bombarded by all these medical and technical information, right? That's often overwhelming. And we've been working on using language models as a way to dramatically simplify the information that's presented to the patients, to make it much easier for them to understand what's going on. And for researchers, I think a big use case of these models is really to help the researchers to dramatically expand the search space of researchers. Right? I'll give you an example of this for drug discovery, where we use AI to help us discover new small molecule drugs. And if you have questions for any of these, you can also feel free to interrupt me in the middle. We don't have to wait until the very end for Q&A. So what I want to do in the next few minutes is to give you an example of how each of these will work, right? So for visual language models, right, for pathology, right, so pathologists and clinicians, right, have to basically make these quite challenging diagnoses based on images, right? So they have to look at images like the one shown here, and then figure out, based on that image, like, what is the diagnosis of the patient, and then from that diagnosis, then you can recommend treatments. Right? So it's a really challenging job because these images can come from different body parts, different diseases. It's very heterogeneous. And often, the pathologists would encounter images that are not familiar to them, right? And in those cases, right, this is where we think that it would be very useful to have like a co-pilot, right, a language model that can look at these images and then provide some additional interpretations that can help the clinicians to make these diagnoses. Now, ideally, to build that co-pilot, you want to have some good demonstration data, right, based of how do expert clinicians interpret and discuss these images, right, among themselves, and you want to collect that demonstration data to train an AI language model, right, so that they can behave like expert clinicians. But that kind of expert demonstration data, as you can imagine, is very challenging and expensive to collect, right? It's hard to get a lot of them. So we have to be pretty creative in getting data to train these models, right? And we found, I think, quite a lot of interesting data from maybe a surprising source, right, which is from social media. So here are a few screenshots that I took of actually posts that clinicians would put on Twitter, where they will actually post the images, and now you can also invite their colleagues from around the world to interpret these images for them, right? They'll have these discussions. And this is pretty interesting, right? Because first, these are de-identified images. They feel comfortable putting them online. But here you actually have these high-quality images, and those you also have a lot of expert interpretations, right, by multiple clinicians around each image, which is exactly the kinds of data that we hope to collect. Right? And this is all sort of in the public. So, and this is, I think, a really untapped, tremendous source of data to training these AI language models, right? So that you can teach them to behave like experts, clinicians. So we went back then to actually collect this data, right? So we curated the script of Twitter from 2006 until recently, and we used these sort of specific hashtags that are used by clinicians to identify the relevant images. And the data you get from Twitter is very noisy, as you can imagine, so we actually have a lot of filters to filter out low-quality images and low-quality text, right, using other classifiers that we built. So after you do the filtering, we still had over 200,000 high-quality Twitter threads, where each Twitter thread would have one or more of these high-quality medical images, along with the corresponding expert discussions around each image. So that's kind of the demonstration data then we can use then to train these basically a chatbot, like a visual language model, to interpret images similar to how an expert human clinician would interpret these images. So we call that model PLIP, right? So what the way that PLIP works is that it has like a text encoder that's trying to extract information from the text, which in this case would be from the text of the tweets, And then the image encoder is trying to extract information from these high-quality medical images, right? And then there's like an alignment step where we teach the text encoder and the image encoder to talk to each other so that the image part understands what the text is looking at. And output of that, after we do the training, is this model that we call CLIP. So here's basically how an example of how this looks like in practice is how our colleagues in the pathology department here at Stanford are using it. Right, so the pathologists, the clinicians can upload their image, right, and the model will first generate some general descriptions about what is in the image. Right? In this case, it would say that this is from the kidney. It counts the number of cells, right? There are about 700 cells in the image. It also describes that there's some inflammation in different parts of the image, right? And it's similar to how you can use like a ChatGPT type model. You can ask it questions, right? And then the model would also look at the image and try to answer those questions based on its interpretation of the image. When we use this in practice, right, some of the clinicians may not trust the generations produced by the model directly because of the risk of hallucination. Right, to mitigate that, we actually built the second retrieval-based usage mode for this model, right, whereby the algorithm would take these images uploaded by the clinician and then actually retrieves from textbooks, from medical records, but also from all the online sources like Twitter, like what are the most similar and relevant images that cases people have posted and discussed before. Right? In this case, I actually identified that, there's a Twitter thread that looked at very similar cases. And then the algorithm was retrieve that and summarizes all that information from the previous discussions, right, to present that to the users. So even if the clinician does not trust the generation by the model itself, they often will still find it very useful to see how did their colleagues have discussed similar cases before. And that's why the algorithm is useful to retrieve all the relevant cases, right, from medical records, textbooks, and online sources, and then summarizes the information for the user. And there's a lot more information that we present in this recent paper. So that hopefully gives you a sense of how we try to tackle this problem for clinicians by building these co-pilots, like a visual language model, to really aggregate and interpret, summarize information for the clinicians. Now, for patients, right, so patients actually often deal with a very different set of problems. Right? One big problem that we often encounter as patients is that the patients, when they go to the hospitals, they're just bombarded with all sorts of information from different technical documents, medical documents that have a lot of jargons in these documents. And oftentimes the patients feel that they're overwhelmed, right? And we want to see, can we actually use language models as a way to dramatically simplify the information, right, for the patients to make the process much easier and more transparent. So just to give you a sense of what this looks like, right? So for example, if you are a patient, right, and if you go to the hospital and have to participate in some surgery, you often would have to fill out these consent forms, right? And the consent forms have a lot of technical medical jargons, right? And it's not that difficult for patients to understand. So most of the consent forms are written at college or post-college level, but most people in the US would read at a middle school level, right? So it's actually a big gap in how much people could understand in these forms, in these documentations. So to address this, we built a system where we essentially try to teach language models to how to dramatically simplify these medical documentations, right, to make it much easier for patients to understand. So the way that we do this is that you start with the existing documentations that are used in hospitals, right, for example, here at Stanford, and then we would teach GPT-4 to take these existing documentations and simplify it into a language that somebody with the 8th grade reading education would be able to understand. And to ensure that the simplified documentations are accurate, then we actually have a panel of legal and medical experts, these could be like lawyers and clinicians, to review both the original document and the simplified documentation to ensure that they're factually accurate and also are sufficient, right, captures the key points. So here's an example of what this looks like in practice, right? So the details are not super important, but the top part here is basically like one of these original documentations that you would face, right, if you had gone into the different hospitals, right? So that's what people were using previously. And I just pull out a few snippets, right, where you can just see that it's written in a way that's not that easy for people to understand. So it's fairly verbose, right? It uses some word jargons. It's not really clear to us even, like what is it trying to say. And the bottom is basically what you get after you do our language model simplification, right? It just sort of explains in much more concise and shorter language, right? Then what is plain English, right? What is the risk and benefits of these different operations? And what's exciting is that after we do this simplification, we show that it's faster to read, it requires less education to read, and it's also much easier for someone to understand, right? So we did a bunch of these different evaluations and user studies. And it's very exciting because then, as of September last year, right, so some of the very large healthcare systems have actually switched their documentations to the ones that's produced by our language model, right? So for example, Lifespan, which is the largest healthcare system in Rhode Island, they've actually, as of September, they actually swapped all of their consent forms so that every time now a patient will go into surgery in Rhode Island in Lifespan, instead of reading these more complicated documentations from before, they would actually look at our language model's simplified documentation. And this is having actually a big impact as one of the, maybe the first example, right, of an actual product from generative AI being deployed at a large-scale healthcare system in the US. And I think this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? You can imagine we can use this to simplify clinical trial study forms, right, all sorts of other documentations to make the whole process much simpler and more transparent for the patients. Okay, so far we talked about how we can use these generative AI tools to help clinicians and to help the patients. Right, so a lot of the work that we do is also in thinking about how do we build these tools to really help researchers, right? And the researchers also have a third different kinds of problem that's different from what clinicians and patients face, right? And we need to build a different set of tools. And in particular, we are very interested in thinking about how can we use these generative AI tools to really expand the search space of researchers, right? So that the researchers can explore, maybe discover new drugs that haven't seen before, they haven't thought of before. And I want to just give you a quick example of how we do this, was actually discovering new antibiotics, right? So antibiotics, it's so bacteria that have developed resistance to the existing antibiotics, right? So that's actually a big healthcare problem right now. So there's over 1 million people die every year because they're exposed to these drug-resistant bacteria, and that number is going to go up very quickly in the next few years. As a consequence, right, you have these bacteria like the one shown here. It doesn't look that dangerous, but it's actually an extremely dangerous pathogen. If you catch it, it's very deadly because this pathogen called Acinetobacter baumannii has developed resistance to most of the known drugs. Right? It's considered by healthcare experts to be the perfect predator because of its resistance. So in a recent work, we actually used generative AI to basically design new drugs, new molecules that we have then since experimentally validated to be effective in killing this dangerous pathogen, right? It's Acinetobacter baumannii. So I'll explain how we actually did that with the help of generative AI. So the idea here is that previously we were talking about language models as kind of generative AI tools, right? So, but here we're not working with language, but we're working with sort of the space of molecules, right? So we have to use kind of different kinds of generative AI tool. And the idea here is that if I look at the potential universe of possible small molecules, right? And the reason why we're interested in small molecules is because most of the drugs are small molecules, right? And if I look at the possible universe of small molecules, right, it's just astronomically large, right? There are exponentially many possible small molecules that one could produce. But all of the small molecules that we've ever seen on this planet, right, on Earth, only makes up like a very small slice of the potential small molecules that we could make. So it would be really useful if we have an AI tool that can help us to explore this vast universe of new small molecules, including ones that we just haven't seen on Earth before. Right? But how do we do that? Right? If we haven't seen it on this planet, then where do we get the data to actually train the AI models? Right? So that's where the interesting challenge is, and it's where Kyle, who's a fantastic computer science PhD student here, working with me, developed this really nice algorithm called Synthemol to help us to generate the entirely novel small molecules that have never been seen before. So the key challenge, right, that we had to solve is that it's actually pretty easy to have an AI to synthesize new molecules, to basically hallucinate new molecules, right? You can just make one up. But the hard part is that if you actually give that molecule to a chemist, then they don't know how to make it, right? We don't know how to actually make that new molecule because it's not seen before on the Earth, right? And if you can't make it, then that doesn't help anybody because you can't really make it into a drug. So then the real problem that we want to solve is to not just have the AI to generate new molecules, but we want to have the AI to produce for us also the recipes for how to make each of these new molecules. Right? And the recipe here, think of this as basically being like a kind of a step-by-step instruction for how a chemist could actually synthesize efficiently each of these new molecules, each of these new drugs. So the recipe in chemistry is similar to the recipes you use in cooking, right? You start with raw ingredients, put them together, and make sort of larger, more complex dishes. So here the raw ingredients in chemistry are what we call sort of fragments, or these are small fragments of molecules that are easily available. You can just order them from different vendors, commercially available. Right? There are hundreds of thousands of these available fragments. And there are different reactions, right? That's when you put these different ingredients together. Each reaction can correspond to a different subset of these molecules, fragments, right? And when you apply that reaction to that subset of molecules as inputs, you get a more complex molecules as output. There are also hundreds of known reactions. Right, so because I can do different fragments and different reactions in different combinations, you can now imagine I have this exponentially large sort of combinatorial space of potential molecules I could build. Right? And again, the known molecules that we've seen on Earth before only represents a very small slice of these potential molecules. So to explore this vast space of new molecules, we actually adapted algorithms that people have developed for playing games. Right? So some of you have maybe heard about AlphaGo, right? So AI for playing Go or for playing chess, right? So all of these game playing algorithms essentially relies on having sort of reinforcement learning to search through these large game trees. So in our settings, instead of having like a big game tree, we have like a tree of molecules, but we want to have similar kinds of algorithms. It's called multi-color tree search, and with reinforcement learning to help us to explore these game trees of molecules very efficiently. So here's what the game of molecules would look like, right? So the moves are the individual fragments, right? That's the building blocks, right? So those are the pieces. And the rules of the game is that I can apply different reactions to these different fragments to build more complex molecules. So if I look at the level 1 of the tree, right, maybe that's the first move I can make, right, I can decide which building block to pick, right? So the level 1 corresponds to the individual building blocks. Again, these are things I can just order from commercial vendors. And then level 2 now corresponds to which building blocks I can put together, right? For example, if I look at this node, this says that I can try to put together building block 1 and 2, and then I can apply some like a move like reaction 27 to building blocks 1 and 2 to get a more complex building block as an output. Right, so basically, if I go down this tree, this game tree of molecules, then I'm starting from simpler pieces and putting them together with different reactions to get more complex molecules out. Right? So the key part here is then how do we efficiently search through this game tree? Right. So to do this, we built like a reward model. So think of this as basically like another AI model that can guide the search through this game tree. The reward model we have is basically a property predictor. It's another graph neural network that looks at the molecules, right, the graph of molecules to predict how likely is this molecule to be a good drug candidate. So we train this property predictor on experimental data that we have collected from the previous drug screens. Right? So that gives the model a sense of like what are the more promising fragments to look at. And then that property predictor will then help us to guide through the exploration of this large, exponentially large tree of molecules. And the property predictor would have to balance a few things like efficacy, right, safety for patients. It also needs to be structurally novel because we're only interested in looking for molecules that are very different from anything that's been seen on Earth before, right? And it should be very easy to synthesize. So that's the algorithm we call SynthMol, which is trained and developed here at Stanford. But the fun part is now, once we train the algorithm, we can get to apply it and actually use it to generate new molecules. Right, so then we actually worked with a company in Ukraine and in Kiev to synthesize these molecules. We sent to them 70 new recipes that are created by our AI models. Each recipe corresponds to a step-by-step instruction for make one new molecule, right? And because they're based in Ukraine, you can imagine that there's a lot of other things going on beyond making molecules for us, right? But they were still very active. And what that means is that they can't really optimize any of our recipes, right? So the recipes basically have to work directly out of the box. And what's really nice here is that by following our AI-generated recipe, the company in Ukraine was able to synthesize 58 out of the 70 new molecules, right? So again, these are 70 molecules that have never been seen on Earth before, but by following the instructions provided by AI, the company was able to make 80% of these new molecules. That's a very good success rate. And we get these molecules back and we test them experimentally. And what's really exciting is that there are 6 of these new AI-generated molecules that experimentally shown to be very effective against the most dangerous pathogens, right? So the World Health Organization has this classification called escape pathogens, which have developed resistance to most of the existing drugs. So 6 out of our AI-generated molecules, when we test them experimentally, they're effective against most of the escape pathogens, right? And we also see that when we do animal model studies, they have low signs of toxicity. So overall, I think there's still more work to be done to do clinical trials in humans, but it's a very exciting demonstration of, for the first time, how we can actually use AI to teach us how to make entirely new molecules, right? And then also experimentally validate and synthesize those and validate them in animal models. So just to wrap up here, so hopefully this gives people a sense broadly of how we can build new types of generative AI tools to address different kinds of audiences, different stakeholders, from clinicians to patients and researchers, right? Then this involves building like language models to aggregate information for clinicians, education tools that can simplify documentations for patients, and then search models that can really expand the search space and creativity of researchers. So I'll stop here and happy to take a few questions. If you have questions, I think there's some mics going around, yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My question is about this, the middle slide, I guess, using ChatGPT for simplifying the medical concept. To me, it seems like somewhat out-of-the-box solution. You just say, you know, create the prompt, simplify this for middle schooler, and then you're done practically, right? Because after that, the legal and medical, they review whether it's acceptable or not. So where is the work for us researchers here?
Yeah, so there's a few things that's useful to make these documentation simplification more reliable, right? So first is that often the documentations do have very specific constraints and do have specific structures, right? There's different sections. So you don't want to just give the whole document to the language model and say, just take that whole thing and simplify it. You want it to keep and obey the specific structures and certain sections of the model. And the second is that we also found it quite useful to have certain types of like in-context learning and other kinds of fine-tuning, right? So to give it sort of specific demonstrations of how one should actually do the simplification, right? Because there's not just taking something and explain it to a 6-year-old, right? You also want to make sure that it's factually accurate as much as possible, but also in a form that transmits as much accurate information as possible.
But you did use the standard ChatGPT, or did you prepare it? Did you fine-tune?
So basically, we take GPT-4 and we give it specific instructions and demonstrations to basically fine-tune it to work well for this task.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah. So there's a question up front.
So any thoughts regarding the next step, which is the clinical trials, selection of patients and the feedback loop that can come all the way through?
Yeah, I think that would be a very good next application of this, because one of the big barriers for clinical trials is that like the trial enrollment protocols are very, they have tens of pages of PDFs, and it's very hard for patients to actually parse through all of those. Right? So we're actually working with our collaborators from GenMab on exactly doing that to try to simplify some of this clinical trial information using a similar kinds of tool that we're building.